The city buzzed with anticipation as the trial of Daniel Reyes commenced in the grand, oak-paneled courtroom of the State Superior Court. The case had dominated headlines for months, drawing in legal analysts, conspiracy theorists, and concerned citizens alike. The trial of a quiet, unassuming librarian accused of murdering one of the city's most revered philanthropists, Elliot Vaughn, was a spectacle that neither the press nor the public could ignore. Judge William Hargrove took his seat, a stern, methodical man who had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state. His silver-rimmed glasses slid down his nose as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. His presence commanded order, but even his stoic demeanor couldn't fully quell the tension thick in the air. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Melissa Grayson, a woman known for her tenacity in the courtroom. With a reputation for airtight cases and a nearly flawless conviction record, she approached the trial with unwavering confidence. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, her sharp eyes swept the room as she rose to deliver her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. "You are here today because a man was brutally murdered. Elliot Vaughn, a beloved philanthropist, businessman, and a man who spent his life giving back to this city, was taken from us in cold blood. And we are here because of one man, Daniel Reyes." She turned and gestured toward the defense table where Reyes sat, his hands folded in his lap. He was a slender man in his early 40s, his dark hair slightly disheveled. He wore a suit that was slightly too large for his frame, and the deep shadows under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights. His attorney, Jack Calloway, sat beside him, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. "The evidence," Grayson continued, "will show beyond a shadow of a doubt that Daniel Reyes committed this crime. You will see security footage placing him near the crime scene. You will hear testimony from officers who found his fingerprints on the murder weapon. And perhaps most damning of all, you will see physical evidence, a torn piece of fabric found at the scene that matches a jacket belonging to the defendant." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as she delivered the final blow of her opening statement. She let it sink in before stepping back to her seat, her face betraying nothing but certainty. Judge Hargrove turned to Calloway. "Mr. Calloway, your opening statement." Jack Calloway rose slowly, buttoning his charcoal gray suit jacket. Unlike Grayson, who was polished and precise, Calloway had a rugged quality about him. His tie slightly loosened, his graying hair always appearing one gust of wind away from complete disarray. But he was a formidable defense attorney, known for unearthing cracks in even the most solid cases. He walked toward the jury box, his hands casually clasped behind his back. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a very compelling story from the prosecution," he began, his voice smooth but firm. "But that's exactly what it is, a story. One that the prosecution desperately wants you to believe without question. However, I'm going to ask you to do something different. I'm going to ask you to question everything." He paused, pacing slightly. "Daniel Reyes is not a killer. He is a law-abiding citizen, a man who has never so much as gotten a parking ticket. And yet, you are being told to believe that he committed a murder so brutal, so calculated, that it left a city in shock." He turned to the jury, locking eyes with each of them. "Does that make sense to you?" Calloway walked back to his table and placed a hand on Reyes's shoulder. "Daniel Reyes is innocent, and the prosecution's so-called evidence, the security footage, the fingerprints, the fabric, doesn't prove guilt. It proves that Daniel was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It proves that someone wants you to think he's guilty." The prosecution objected to his implication, but Judge Hargrove simply raised a hand. "Sustained. Mr. Calloway, stick to your opening statement." Calloway nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to the jury. "What we're going to do in this trial is unravel the truth. We're going to show you that the evidence doesn't add up. And when we do, you'll see that the real criminal is still out there, while an innocent man is sitting here, fighting for his life." With that, Calloway returned to his seat. The air in the courtroom felt charged, the stage set for what was sure to be a dramatic legal battle. The prosecution wasted no time calling its first witness, Officer Ray Lutz, the lead detective on the case. A seasoned officer with 2 decades on the force, Lutz carried himself with confidence. He took the stand, adjusted his tie, and swore to tell the truth. Grayson approached. "Detective Lutz, can you walk us through the night of Elliot Vaughn's murder?" Lutz nodded. At approximately 9:45 p.m. on the night of April 12th, officers responded to a call about a possible homicide at Vaughn's residence. Upon arrival, we found Mr. Vaughn deceased in his study. The room showed signs of struggle, papers scattered, a broken lamp, and blood splatter indicating close-range force. The cause of death was a fatal stab wound to the abdomen. Grayson nodded. "And what led you to suspect Mr. Reyes?" Lutz turned his gaze toward the defendant. Security footage from a camera outside Vaughn's residence showed Reyes walking down the street near the victim's home around the estimated time of death. Additionally, a knife was recovered from a trash bin behind the property, and forensic analysis confirmed that Mr. Reyes's fingerprints were on it. A gasp came from the spectators. Grayson seized the moment. "And was there anything else tying him to the scene?" Lutz nodded. A torn piece of dark fabric was found near the victim's body. When we later searched Mr. Reyes's home, we found a jacket with a missing patch of fabric that was a match. Grayson turned to the jury. "Let the record show that Mr. Reyes had not only the opportunity, but also direct physical evidence linking him to this crime." Calloway stood. "Objection, Your Honor. She's making conclusions before we've had a chance to cross-examine." Judge Hargrove nodded. "Sustained. Let's stick to the facts, Ms. Grayson." Grayson nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Calloway rose and approached the witness stand, his eyes sharp. "Detective Lutz, you said security footage shows my client walking near Vaughn's residence. How close exactly?" Lutz hesitated. "About a block away." Calloway tilted his head. "A block away. So to be clear, the footage does not show my client entering the residence, correct?" Lutz exhaled. "Number but—" Calloway held up a hand. No further questions at this time. He walked back to his seat, knowing that despite the prosecution's strong start, there were already cracks forming. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the judge called for a recess. The jury, visibly engrossed, filed out, and the press scrambled to analyze the developments so far. The trial had just begun, but already the battle lines had been drawn. The trial of Daniel Reyes was unfolding with relentless precision. The air inside courtroom 4B was thick with tension, a silent battle waged between the defense and the prosecution. At the center of it all sat Daniel, accused of murdering Elliot Vaughn, a powerful philanthropist whose influence extended deep into the city's political and financial circles. ADA Melissa Grayson had laid out damning evidence in the first days of the trial: surveillance footage, fingerprints on the murder weapon, and a torn piece of fabric that allegedly matched Daniel's jacket. Judge William Hargrove, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, ensured the trial moved at a strict pace. He had seen hundreds of cases in his career, but something about this one gnawed at him. And then, at the most unexpected moment, a distraction entered the courtroom. A golden retriever, dusty, unkempt, and seemingly out of place, trotted in from the open double doors at the back. The low murmur of the gallery grew into a wave of whispers. Jurors turned their heads. The court clerk, Sharon Willis, looked at Judge Hargrove, awaiting instruction. Hargrove sighed, rubbing his temple. "Is there a reason why there's a dog in my courtroom?" A bailiff, a stocky man with a permanent scowl, quickly approached the dog. "Where the hell did it come from?" he muttered under his breath, reaching for the retriever's collar, only to find none. The dog, rather than shrinking away, wagged its tail and darted around the courtroom in an elegant loop, dodging the bailiff's attempts to catch it. The retriever was quick, far quicker than anyone anticipated. The court officials found themselves in a brief but humiliating chase, prompting scattered chuckles in the gallery. Judge Hargrove's gavel slammed down. "Enough! Get that dog out of here!" The bailiff made another grab for the retriever, but in an unexpected twist, the dog suddenly slowed its pace and walked toward the defendant's table. Daniel Reyes, who had barely spoken throughout the trial, straightened as the golden retriever sat beside him. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Daniel's defense attorney, Jack Calloway, raised an eyebrow at the scene. "Well," he said with a smirk, "I don't suppose the prosecution is calling this dog as a witness, are they?" Melissa Grayson shot him an unimpressed glare, turning back toward Judge Hargrove. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. We need this dog removed immediately." "I second that," Hargrove muttered. He pointed at the bailiff again. "Get animal control. Now." The bailiff hesitated, glancing at the dog, which had made itself comfortable next to Daniel. Daniel, who had hardly shown emotion throughout the trial, reached out hesitantly and placed his hand on the golden retriever's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing for a brief moment, as though it had been waiting for this exact interaction. Jack Calloway noticed the moment and capitalized on it instantly. "Seems like he's taken a liking to my client," he mused. "Maybe the dog has a better sense of character than some of the people in this courtroom." Melissa Grayson let out a sharp breath. "Your Honor, can we please maintain order?" Judge Hargrove nodded. "Proceed, but that dog needs to be removed as soon as animal control arrives." The golden retriever, however, remained perfectly still, sitting beside Daniel as though it belonged there. The courtroom refocused as Melissa Grayson resumed her questioning of Detective Ray Lutz, the lead investigator on the case. "Detective," she said, regaining her composure, "let's go over the timeline again for the jury. When did you arrive at the crime scene?" Lutz cleared his throat, shifting slightly under the attention. "Vaughn's body was discovered at approximately 10:47 p.m. by a private security guard. I arrived on the scene at 11:02 p.m. The victim had been dead for at least an hour." Grayson nodded. "And was there any sign of forced entry?" "No," Lutz said firmly, which suggests the killer either had a key or was let in willingly. Grayson turned to the jury, letting the implication settle. "And to confirm, where was Daniel Reyes during this time?" Lutz turned a page in his notes. "According to the security footage, he was seen near the entrance of Vaughn's estate at 9:45 p.m. He entered the premises but was never seen leaving." Grayson walked to the prosecution's evidence table, picking up a black and white photograph of the torn fabric found at the scene. "And let's talk about this." Lutz adjusted his glasses. "That's the torn piece of clothing we found near the victim's body. It matches the jacket Reyes was known to wear." Grayson turned to the jury again. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has shown you video evidence of the defendant entering the crime scene, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, and now a piece of his own clothing found beside the victim's body." She set the photo down. "The facts speak for themselves." A quiet moment settled over the courtroom. Then, from beside Daniel, the dog let out a soft huff. Jack Calloway noticed and smiled. "Detective Lutz," Calloway said, standing up, "how many articles of clothing were recovered from the crime scene?" Lutz hesitated. "Just that one." Calloway paced slowly, letting the jury observe his measured tone. "So let's clarify. You're saying my client, after committing this supposed crime, managed to clean the murder weapon of all blood, dispose of any other forensic evidence, but left behind one perfect piece of fabric connecting him to the scene?" Lutz's jaw tensed. "It's not impossible." Calloway chuckled. "Not impossible, but highly convenient." He turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is airtight, but I urge you to consider something. Evidence can be planted. Evidence can be manipulated. And when we start looking at the details, things don't add up." Melissa Grayson immediately objected. "Speculation." Judge Hargrove considered it, then nodded. "Sustained. Move on, Mr. Calloway. Calloway sighed theatrically. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to Lutz. Let's talk about the knife. You say it had Daniel Reyes's fingerprints, but no blood? Lutz shifted. That's correct. And that doesn't strike you as strange? It's possible he wiped it off. Calloway nodded. Possible, but again, convenient. The golden retriever lifted its head slightly, watching the exchange with keen eyes. Calloway glanced down at the dog before continuing. Detective, can you confirm where my client's jacket is now? Lutz hesitated. It's still in evidence storage. Calloway raised an eyebrow. And it has a matching tier? Lutz hesitated a second too long. Jack Calloway smiled. Interesting. The jury, already showing signs of doubt, began exchanging glances. As the exchange went on, the golden retriever remained eerily calm, observing each speaker carefully. Even Judge Hargrove couldn't help but glance at the dog occasionally, as though sensing something peculiar about its presence. Bailiff Carl Jansen returned from a side door and approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, Animal Control says they'll be delayed another 20 minutes. Hargrove let out a frustrated breath. Fine, let's keep moving. He glanced at the golden retriever once more. It stared right back. For the first time in a long time, Judge William Hargrove felt something unsettling. The tension inside courtroom 4B was palpable. The presence of the golden retriever, which had disrupted the proceedings earlier, was still a curiosity, though most in the courtroom had now tried to ignore it. The dog sat calmly beside Daniel Reyes, as if it had every right to be there. Judge William Hargrove had been impatient about the situation, but had no choice other than to allow the trial to continue while waiting for Animal Control to arrive. He had seen distractions before, but never one quite like this. Clearing his throat, he rapped his gavel twice. Let's get back to the matter at hand. Prosecution, continue. Melissa Grayson straightened her posture, walking toward the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Detective Raymond Lutz to the stand. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Detective Lutz entered. He looked stiff, his face betraying a hint of unease as he made his way to the witness stand. Jack Calloway, Daniel's defense attorney, leaned back in his chair, arms folded. He watched Lutz carefully, already sensing that something was off about the detective's body language. The bailiff stepped forward. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Lutz nodded, placing his right hand on the Bible. I do. Judge Hargrove motioned for Grayson to begin. Detective Lutz, let's discuss the murder weapon, Grayson said as she walked toward the jury. You were one of the first officers on the scene. Can you confirm how the weapon was discovered? Lutz adjusted his tie before answering. Yes. The knife was found near the victim's body, approximately 3 feet away, partially hidden beneath a fallen chair. Upon closer inspection, we recovered partial fingerprints that were later matched to Daniel Reyes. Grayson nodded, taking her time to let the jury absorb the information. So, just to clarify, the knife was found close to the body, within the same room where Mr. Vaughn was murdered. That's correct. And forensic analysis confirmed that Mr. Reyes's fingerprints were on the knife? Yes. Before Grayson could ask her next question, a sharp bark suddenly cut through the courtroom. Everyone froze. All eyes turned to the golden retriever. The dog had barked once, just once, right at the moment Lutz finished his answer. A ripple of laughter passed through the gallery, but a moment later, the silence became even more unnerving than the noise. Judge Hargrove narrowed his eyes at the dog, clearly losing patience. Bailiff, remove that animal immediately. The bailiff hesitated, stepping toward the dog. But before he could act, Jack Calloway spoke up. Your Honor, if I may, the dog hasn't actually disrupted testimony. It's merely responding to the discussion just like the jury is. The gallery chuckled again. Judge Hargrove shot Calloway a stern look. Mr. Calloway, I'm running out of patience with these antics. Calloway held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm merely pointing out that the dog seems to have an opinion on the matter, but by all means, let's continue. Hargrove sighed, then turned back to Grayson. Proceed. Melissa Grayson gave a pointed glare toward the defense before turning her attention back to Lutz. Detective Lutz, let's continue. The prosecution argues that the defendant's fingerprints on the knife are direct evidence linking him to the crime. Would you agree? Yes, Lutz said firmly. Jack Calloway immediately stood up. Objection. Hargrove exhaled. On what grounds, Mr. Calloway? Calloway walked slowly toward the center of the room, his expression unreadable. On the grounds that the detective is making an assumption. He's implying that fingerprints alone are enough to determine guilt, but let's analyze that for a moment. Judge Hargrove considered it, then nodded. Sustained. Rephrase your question, Ms. Grayson. Grayson tightened her jaw. Detective Lutz, let me put it differently. What was unusual, if anything, about the knife? Lutz paused. There was no blood on it. A small stir ran through the jury. Jack Calloway immediately seized the moment. Detective, let me get this straight. You're saying that the murder weapon, used to stab a man multiple times, had fingerprints, but no blood. Lutz's jaw tightened. That's correct. Calloway began pacing. And you don't find that odd? Lutz hesitated. It's possible the suspect wiped it clean after using it. Calloway pounced. So you're suggesting that my client was careful enough to wipe off every trace of blood, but somehow forgot to wipe off his own fingerprints? Silence. Lutz shifted uncomfortably. That's one possibility, yes. The jury exchanged glances. The seed of doubt had been planted. Bark! Another sharp bark echoed through the courtroom. Once again, all heads turned to the golden retriever. It had barked at the exact moment Lutz finished speaking. For the first time, Judge Hargrove looked unsure. He stared at the dog, then at Lutz. Something was off. Grayson quickly moved to regain control. Your Honor, I ask that we ignore the distraction and continue questioning the witness. Judge Hargrove hesitated for a long moment, then finally nodded. Proceed. Jack Calloway turned back to Lutz, his expression now sharper. Detective, let's consider another possibility. What if the knife wasn't the actual murder weapon at all? Melissa Grayson immediately objected. Objection! Speculative? Hargrove nodded. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Calloway. But the damage had been done. The jury was now questioning the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Jack turned and made one last observation. Detective Lutz, how long did it take for the murder weapon to be logged into evidence? Lutz swallowed. Approximately 4 hours. Jack raised an eyebrow. 4 hours? That seems like an awfully long time for a crucial piece of evidence. Who had possession of it before then? Lutz hesitated. That single hesitation was more damning than any outright admission. Melissa Grayson could feel the case slipping. She quickly stepped in, steering the conversation back to safe territory. Detective, based on your investigation, does the evidence still point to Daniel Reyes as the most likely suspect? Lutz straightened his back. Yes, it does. Jack Calloway smiled to himself. The jury had already seen the hesitation. The dog had barked twice at Lutz's most crucial answers. Whether they admitted it or not, people were now questioning the case. The courtroom had shifted. The jury had seen Detective Ray Lutz hesitate. They had heard Jack Calloway's cutting questions, and most of all, they had noticed the golden retriever now sitting silently at Daniel Reyes's feet, watching the trial unfold with an eerie attentiveness. Despite Judge William Hargrove's repeated orders for the dog to be removed, animal control had yet to arrive, and at this point, even he seemed reluctant to halt the proceedings. Melissa Grayson, determined to regain control, moved swiftly. Your Honor, Grayson said, straightening her blouse as she approached the prosecution's table, the state would like to present a crucial piece of physical evidence. Jack Calloway, seated at the defense table, leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Grayson lifted a sealed evidence bag and turned toward the jury. Inside was a small, jagged piece of fabric, charcoal gray with faint blue stitching. She walked with practiced confidence. This piece of fabric was recovered near the victim's body. Upon forensic analysis, it was determined to be a perfect match to a jacket belonging to the defendant, Daniel Reyes. Not only does this place him at the scene of the crime, but it suggests a physical struggle took place. Jack Calloway sat forward, interlocking his fingers. He waited. "Detective Lutz," Grayson continued, turning back toward the stand. "Can you confirm the chain of custody for this evidence?" Lutz, still slightly off balance from his earlier testimony, cleared his throat. "Yes. The fabric was recovered by our forensic team and entered into evidence under my supervision. It was then compared to a jacket owned by Mr. Reyes, which had a matching tier." Grayson turned to the jury. "A matching tier," she repeated for emphasis. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not circumstantial evidence. This is physical proof that Daniel Reyes was at the scene, engaged in a confrontation with Elliot Vaughn before his murder." She let the words hang in the air. The prosecution's case hinged on this moment. The jury was back in her hands. Then, suddenly, bark! The sharp sound cut through the room, snapping everyone's attention back to the golden retriever. The dog had been completely silent since the last disruption. Now, out of nowhere, it had barked at the precise moment Grayson presented the evidence. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Melissa Grayson's mouth tightened. "Your Honor." Judge Hargrove rapped his gavel. "That's it. Bailiff, remove that animal immediately." The bailiff hesitated, but before he could act, Jack Calloway stood smoothly. "Your Honor, given the significance of this evidence, the defense formally requests a closer examination of the fabric in question." Melissa Grayson turned toward him sharply. "Absolutely not. This evidence has already been analyzed." Calloway smiled, taking slow steps toward the evidence table. "If the prosecution is so confident, I'm sure they won't mind us taking a closer look. After all," he turned to the jury, "we want to ensure justice is served, don't we?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hargrove sighed. "Very well, Mr. Calloway. Proceed." Calloway stepped forward as the bailiff reluctantly handed him the evidence bag. He turned it over in his hands, eyes narrowing. "Detective Lutz," Calloway said, not looking up from the evidence, "you said this fabric was an exact match to Mr. Reyes's jacket?" Lutz nodded stiffly. "That's right." Calloway held the bag up to the light. The stitching caught his eye. He smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning toward the jury, "this fabric does appear to be a close match to my client's jacket. But there's a problem." He turned the bag over again, tapping the stitches. "The stitching pattern is wrong." A ripple of whispers filled the room. Grayson rolled her eyes. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous." Calloway held up a finger. "Let's break it down. The prosecution claims that this piece of fabric was torn directly from my client's jacket. If that's true, then it should be an exact match, every detail, every seam." He walked toward the evidence table and retrieved Daniel's actual jacket, which had been entered into evidence earlier. "Your Honor, may I?" Hargrove nodded, now fully invested. Calloway held up the jacket for the jury to see. "Look at the stitching on my client's jacket. You'll notice a distinct pattern of double-threaded seams along the lining." He then held up the fabric from the evidence bag. "Now, look at this." He pointed to the edges of the torn piece. Single-threaded seams, completely different. Melissa Grayson's face darkened. The jury was now leaning forward. Calloway grinned inwardly. "Hooked them." "So, Detective," Calloway said, turning back to Lutz, "either my client somehow owned two identical jackets with completely different stitching patterns, which would be absurd, or—" He let the question linger. Lutz clenched his jaw. "It's possible there was a mix-up in the forensic lab?" Ah. Calloway snapped his fingers. A mix-up? With key evidence? How very convenient. Grayson immediately stepped forward. Your Honor, this is a meaningless discrepancy. The color and material match. We're not going to let a small difference in stitching discredit hard evidence. Calloway raised a brow. Small difference? This entire case is built on details, Ms. Grayson. He faced the jury. The prosecution is asking you to believe that Daniel Reyes's jacket was torn during a struggle with Elliot Vaughn. But what we've just shown is that this fabric does not come from his jacket at all. The jury murmured again. Judge Hargrove rubbed his temple, clearly annoyed. Ms. Grayson, how do you respond? Grayson exhaled sharply. Your Honor, we will have our forensic analysts verify the stitching issue immediately. However, I must insist that this does not diminish the overwhelming evidence against the defendant. Calloway smirked, slipping his hands into his pockets. Funny. I was under the impression that real evidence should be airtight. But hey, maybe I'm just old-fashioned. A light chuckle came from the jury box. Grayson glared at Calloway. Judge Hargrove tapped his gavel. Very well. We will take a short recess while the prosecution arranges a forensic review. The moment the words left his mouth, the golden retriever let out a low, satisfied huff. Jack Calloway glanced at the dog, then at Daniel Reyes. Something was happening here. Something no one could explain. And Calloway was starting to believe that this stray dog wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was here for a reason. The tension in courtroom 4B had shifted dramatically. The supposed fabric evidence, which the prosecution had relied on to cement Daniel Reyes's guilt, had just been called into question by Jack Calloway. The difference in stitching patterns had caused a noticeable stir in the jury, and even Judge Hargrove, who prided himself on keeping emotions out of his courtroom, looked unsettled. Melissa Grayson, the prosecution's lead attorney, stood rigid at her table, a deep frown creasing her forehead. This was supposed to be her moment, the moment when the weight of physical evidence crushed the defense's flimsy arguments. But now things were slipping. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, bark! A sharp, third bark rang out, echoing through the silent courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the golden retriever, which had remained eerily still for the last few minutes, suddenly sprang to life. Without hesitation, the dog darted toward the prosecution's table. A bailiff stepped forward, reacting on instinct, but the retriever was too fast. Before anyone could intervene, the dog jumped up on its hind legs, front paws pressing against the prosecution's evidence table. The jury gasped again as the dog began pawing aggressively at the plastic evidence bag containing the torn fabric. Judge Hargrove's gavel slammed down. "Control that animal!" The bailiff lunged, but before he could grab the dog, Jack Calloway was already on his feet. Your Honor, I move for an immediate re-examination of that evidence. Melissa Grayson looked outraged. Absolutely not. This is nonsense. But the courtroom wasn't buying it. The jury had seen the hesitation in Detective Lutz's earlier testimony. They had seen the questionable stitching patterns, and now this stray dog, which had inexplicably barked only at key moments, was fixated on that very piece of evidence. Jack Calloway seized the moment. Your Honor, if the prosecution is so confident in this evidence, why not let us take another look? Hargrove was furious at the chaos in his courtroom, but even he couldn't deny that something felt off. With a heavy sigh, he pointed a finger at the bailiff. Retrieve the evidence, now. The golden retriever let out a low, satisfied sound and stepped back from the table, as if it had done its job. The bailiff picked up the sealed plastic bag and brought it to the judge's bench. Judge Hargrove, now visibly impatient, held it up. He narrowed his eyes, inspecting the fabric through the plastic. Then his brow furrowed. Calloway leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. Your Honor, I believe we need an immediate forensic analysis, because I don't think this fabric comes from my client's jacket at all. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Melissa Grayson's face darkened. That is completely unfounded. Judge Hargrove, ignoring her, turned to the bailiff. Open it. The bailiff hesitated. This was highly unusual, but at the judge's command, he retrieved a pair of forensic gloves, carefully opened the evidence bag, and extracted the torn piece of fabric. The courtroom held its breath. The bailiff placed the fabric on the evidence display table, smoothing it out under the light. For the first time, the entire courtroom could see the full piece. Jack Calloway took a step forward, his eyes sharp. Detective Lutz, you claim this fabric was taken from my client's jacket, correct? Lutz's throat bobbed as he swallowed. That's correct. Calloway pointed. Then explain this, because this fabric isn't from my client's jacket. A moment of stunned silence. Judge Hargrove narrowed his eyes. Explain. Calloway reached over and turned the fabric inside out, revealing a distinctive patterned lining. Your Honor, my client's jacket has no lining. This fabric, however, does. He turned toward the jury, his voice deliberate. Which means this was never from Daniel Reyes's jacket. This fabric belongs to someone else entirely. The courtroom froze. Judge Hargrove's expression hardened. He turned toward Detective Lutz, his voice like steel. Detective, how do you explain this? Lutz looked like a man caught in a noose tightening around his neck. I don't know. The lab must have made a mistake. Calloway pressed forward. A mistake? Or was this piece of evidence planted? The word planted sent a shockwave through the room. Grayson, now visibly shaken, quickly intervened. Your Honor, let's not rush to conclusions. Calloway cut her off. Let's rush, Ms. Grayson, because my client's life is on the line. His voice echoed across the courtroom. Then, suddenly, B-A-R-K, a fourth bark. The golden retriever, still seated near Daniel, was now looking directly at Detective Lutz. Lutz visibly flinched. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Hargrove's eyes darkened. We are taking an immediate recess. I want a forensic team to analyze this evidence immediately. Melissa Grayson tried to object, but the judge's gavel slammed down with finality. Now. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. The jury looked uneasy. The gallery was whispering. The very foundation of the prosecution's case was crumbling. And Detective Lutz was sweating. The golden retriever simply sat there, tail wagging gently, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. The moment Judge William Hargrove's gavel slammed down, chaos erupted in courtroom 4B. Jurors exchanged stunned glances. The gallery buzzed with whispered speculation. The golden retriever, now unofficially named Lucky, sat near Daniel Reyes, tail flicking lazily, as if completely unfazed by the bombshell that had just detonated in the courtroom. At the prosecution's table, Melissa Grayson was already whispering in urgent tones to Detective Ray Lutz, whose usually stoic expression was beginning to crack. He rubbed his hands together, then ran one through his short, graying hair. His shirt, pristine at the start of the day, was now wrinkled from his nervous fidgeting. Jack Calloway watched them from across the room. He knew that look. Lutz was scared, and Calloway had every intention of finding out why. Judge Hargrove stood, his presence towering even at his old age. Court is in recess until tomorrow morning. I expect a full forensic report on the contested evidence before proceedings resume. With that, he turned and disappeared into his chambers, leaving the room to erupt in speculation. Jack Calloway didn't waste a second. He spun toward his legal assistant, Maya Patel, a sharp-witted paralegal who had been with him for 5 years. Get on the phone with Forensic Services, he ordered. I want that fabric analyzed tonight. Maya nodded, already dialing. You think they'll find something? Calloway grabbed his briefcase. I think they'll find that it was never Daniel's fabric to begin with. Maya raised an eyebrow. And whose was it? Jack glanced across the courtroom, his sharp gaze landing on Detective Lutz, who was hurriedly gathering his notes, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I don't know yet, Calloway muttered, but I sure as hell plan on finding out. As they turned to leave, Lucky trotted alongside them, sticking close to Calloway. Maya smirked. Looks like you've got a new sidekick. Jack sighed. Great, just what I need. An unpaid intern with fur. Lucky let out a short woof. Meanwhile, across the courthouse, Melissa Grayson stormed into the prosecution's private meeting room, slamming the door behind her. Detective Lutz followed, but he didn't sit. He paced, his movements erratic. Grayson turned on him, arms crossed. What the hell is going on, Ray? Lutz ran a hand over his face. I don't know how this happened. The evidence should match the jacket. Grayson's eyes narrowed. But it doesn't, which means either the forensic lab screwed up or... She let the implication hang in the air. Lutz stopped pacing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Are you hiding something? She asked, voice low. No, Lutz snapped too quickly. Grayson wasn't stupid. She saw the sweat on his collar, the way his gaze flicked toward the door, as if he was itching to escape. She took a slow step forward. Ray, if there's something you're not telling me, now is the time to... I said no. His voice was hard now, final. For the first time in her career, Melissa Grayson didn't trust her own witness. Jack Calloway and Maya exited the courthouse into the crisp night air. The city hummed around them, streetlights flickering, distant car horns blaring, but Jack's mind was firmly on the case. Lucky trotted at his side, completely comfortable walking alongside a seasoned defense attorney like they'd been partners for years. Maya glanced down at the dog. You realize we can't bring him into the office, right? Jack exhaled. Well, he won't leave, so I guess he's coming with us. They reached Calloway's car, and before he could even open the door, Lucky jumped into the passenger seat. Maya burst out laughing. I guess that settles it. Jack stared at the dog. You better not shed all over my seats. Lucky simply wagged his tail, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. By midnight, the contested fabric evidence was under review at Forensic Services, a private lab known for its meticulous work. Jack, Maya, and even Lucky sat in a small, glass-walled observation room, watching as forensic technician Dr. Henry Coates examined the sample under high-powered magnification. Calloway folded his arms. What are we looking for? Dr. Coates didn't glance up. Fibers, textile origins, any biological markers that indicate who actually wore this fabric. The words hung heavy in the air. Jack tapped his fingers against the table. Any idea on time frame? Coates adjusted his glasses. For a basic textile match? Few hours? If we're running DNA? He shrugged. That's an overnight job. Maya leaned forward. But you're already seeing something, aren't you? Coates hesitated. Then he sighed. Yes, and you're not going to like it. Jack stiffened. Talk to me. Coates turned to face them fully, lifting the fabric sample between two gloved fingers. This isn't from a civilian retail jacket, he said. It's from a law enforcement-issued coat. Jack's breath hitched. Maya's eyes widened. You mean... Yes, Coates confirmed. This fabric came from a police officer's jacket. Lucky, as if sensing the weight of the revelation, let out a low growl. Jack sat in his office later that night, staring at the forensic report. The implications were staggering. The fabric that was supposed to place Daniel Reyes at the crime scene was actually from a police-issued jacket. Jack reached for his whiskey glass but didn't drink. He was too busy piecing it together. Detective Lutz had been acting off all day. The dog, Lucky, had barked only at key moments in Lutz's testimony. And now Jack had scientific proof that the case against his client had been built on fabric that didn't belong to him. His mind ran through the possibilities. Had Lutz planted evidence? Was he covering for someone? Or was he the real murderer? Before he could spiral further, Lucky stood up from where he had been lying beside Jack's desk. The dog padded over and placed a paw on Jack's knee. Jack looked down at him, meeting those strangely intelligent eyes. Lucky wagged his tail once. Jack let out a slow breath. "Yeah, buddy, I think we just cracked this thing wide open." By 8 a.m., Jack Calloway was back in Judge Hargrove's chambers, presenting the forensic report. The judge read the findings, his expression growing darker by the second. Finally, he set the papers down. "This is bad," Hargrove said, voice dangerously low. "If the chain of custody on this evidence was compromised, it could mean intentional tampering." Jack nodded. "Which is why I'm requesting a full investigation into Detective Lutz." The judge exhaled sharply. "I'll allow it. The trial is officially paused until we get answers." Jack shook his head. "I don't think we need to wait long, Your Honor." He turned toward the courtroom doors. "Because I know exactly who I need to talk to." By the time the sun rose over the city, Jack Calloway was already wide awake, sipping black coffee in his dimly lit office. The forensic report confirming that the fabric belonged to a police-issued jacket sat open on his desk. But the final revelation had arrived just minutes ago. It wasn't just any jacket. The material had been cross-referenced in the department's uniform database. The forensic team had matched the stitching pattern, fiber weave, and internal serial number format to a jacket registered to Detective Ray Lutz himself. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. He had suspected Lutz was involved, but this changed everything. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't a forensic mistake. This was deliberate evidence tampering. And now Jack had the proof. At that moment, Lucky, the golden retriever who had somehow been in the right place at the right time since the trial began, padded over and sat by Jack's feet, staring up at him with expectant eyes. Jack smirked. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Lucky wagged his tail. Jack shook his head. "Yeah, well, you're not the only one." He grabbed his coat. "Come on, we've got a cop to bury." Jack strode into the courthouse later that morning, the forensic report tucked under his arm. The moment he stepped into the hallway outside Judge Hargrove's chambers, he saw Melissa Grayson already waiting, arms crossed, jaw tight. She was expecting him. "You look pissed," Jack said casually, stopping a few feet away. "I should be," she snapped. "You could have come to me first." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Would you have listened?" Grayson exhaled sharply but said nothing. Jack held up the forensic report. This isn't just a mistake, Melissa. The evidence didn't just get mixed up, it was planted. And guess who the jacket belongs to?" Grayson's lips parted slightly, her mind racing through the implications. "Lutz," she whispered. Jack nodded. "And I'm guessing you didn't know." Her silence was answer enough. Grayson looked away, her hands tightening into fists. "I vouched for that man," she muttered. Jack's tone softened just a fraction. "Then you have a choice. You can keep defending this case, keep pushing for a conviction that never should have happened, or you can help me expose the truth." Melissa hesitated. She had spent her career fighting to uphold the law. If Lutz had compromised the integrity of this trial, then she had to make it right. She met Jack's gaze. "You think Lutz was involved in the actual murder?" Jack shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I do know he planted that fabric, and I know he's hiding something." Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "What's your next move?" Jack smiled. "Security footage." Within an hour, Jack and Maya sat inside the courthouse security office, watching the archived surveillance footage from the night of Elliot Vaughn's murder. A security officer, a gruff-looking man named Pete, controlled the playback. "This is the east side entrance of Vaughn's estate," he explained. "Cameras only cover the exterior, but they run all night." Jack leaned forward as Pete rewound the footage to 9:45 p.m., the time Daniel Reyes allegedly arrived. Sure enough, Daniel was seen approaching the estate. Jack watched closely. Daniel entered the property, then the camera angle lost sight of him. Pete fast-forwarded. 10:30 p.m., nothing. 10:45 p.m., nothing. Then, at 11:01 p.m. movement. A man in a dark-colored jacket appeared near the eastern property exit. Jack squinted at the screen. Pause that. Pete froze the frame. Jack pointed. Enhance that jacket. The officer zoomed in, sharpening the image. Maya gasped. The stitching, the lining, the fabric. It was the exact same material as the planted evidence. And the man wearing it? Detective Ray Lutz. Jack let out a slow breath, his suspicions confirmed. There he is. Maya shook her head. Why the hell was he there that night? Jack turned to Pete. Is there footage of him entering the property? Pete checked. No, this is the only clip where he shows up. Jack tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. Then he didn't come in through the front. He knew the cameras wouldn't catch him, but he was there. Maya leaned in. And the murder happened around 10:45 p.m. Jack's eyes darkened, which means he was on site just 15 minutes later. Maya exhaled. Jack, I think we just proved it. Lutz wasn't just investigating the crime scene. He was already there when Vaughn was killed. Jack nodded. And now we take it to the judge. Judge Hargrove sat in his private chambers, his fingers steepled as he read through the forensic report. After what felt like an eternity, he set it down and let out a slow, measured breath. This is damning, he muttered. Jack, seated across from him, nodded. That's an understatement. Hargrove leaned back in his chair. You're prepared to present this in court tomorrow? Yes, Jack said. And I'm requesting an immediate inquiry into Detective Ray Lutz. Hargrove considered that. This could destroy his career. Jack's gaze was unwavering. If he planted evidence, he deserves to lose his career. The judge tapped a pen against his desk. And you're convinced he was near the scene at the time of the murder? Jack slid a USB drive across the desk. Security footage confirms it. Hargrove took it, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Very well. The court will reconvene tomorrow morning. Jack exhaled, knowing this was the turning point. Tomorrow, he would present everything. And if all went according to plan, Daniel Reyes would walk free. As Jack stood to leave, Lucky, who had been sitting silently near his chair, stretched and yawned. Judge Hargrove glanced at the dog. He still doesn't have an owner. Jack smirked. I think he's adopted me at this point. Hargrove chuckled. Well, whatever he is, he certainly has an eye for the truth. Jack gave Lucky a pat on the head. That makes two of us. The morning sun hung low over the Hall of Justice, casting long shadows as reporters crowded the steps. The previous day's recess had sent the city into a frenzy of speculation. Whispers of fabric evidence tampering, a compromised detective, and a possible frame job had spread like wildfire. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was electric. Jurors shifted in their seats, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. The gallery, packed beyond its usual capacity, hummed with low conversation. Even Judge William Hargrove, usually composed and detached, looked uneasy. Jack Calloway sat at the defense table, his case files meticulously organized, but he wasn't looking at his notes. He was watching Detective Ray Lutz. Across the room, Lutz sat stiffly, his broad shoulders squared, but his jaw tight, hands clasped together in his lap. The normally confident detective was avoiding eye contact. A thin layer of sweat glistened at his temples. Lucky, the golden retriever who had somehow positioned himself at the heart of this case, sat at Jack's feet, silent but alert. His ears were perked forward, his eyes locked on Lutz. Jack had no idea how the dog knew what it knew, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything. Judge Hargrove rapped his gavel. Court is now in session. Mr. Calloway, you may proceed. Jack stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he stepped toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady. Yesterday, the prosecution presented fabric evidence that was supposed to place my client, Daniel Reyes, at the scene of Elliot Vaughn's murder. He gestured toward the evidence table, where the now infamous torn fabric sample sat in a plastic bag. But as you now know, forensic testing proved something astonishing. That fabric? It didn't come from Daniel Reyes's jacket at all. Jack turned, his voice growing sharper. It came from a jacket belonging to none other than Detective Ray Lutz. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Melissa Grayson, the assistant district attorney, bristled but remained silent. She had spent the previous night processing the full extent of Lutz's betrayal, and now, for the first time in the trial, she wasn't opposing Jack Calloway. Jack turned to the jury. The very detective in charge of this investigation had evidence from his own clothing submitted as proof against my client. He faced Lutz directly. "Detective, how do you explain that?" Lutz shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat. I don't know how that happened. The lab must have mixed up the samples." Jack pounced. "Oh, a mix-up. Just like how the supposed murder weapon had my client's fingerprints but no blood. Just like how you testified under oath that the evidence chain was airtight." Lutz opened his mouth, then closed it. Jack turned back to the jury, pacing slowly. "We're being asked to believe that multiple mistakes all just happened, but those mistakes all conveniently point to my client being guilty." He stopped walking. His next words were deliberate. Or maybe they weren't mistakes at all. The courtroom was dead silent. Then a low, rumbling growl filled the space. It was Lucky. The golden retriever, who had remained quiet throughout the trial, was now staring directly at Lutz, his teeth bared slightly, a deep warning sound rising from his throat. A visible shudder ran through Lutz's body. Jack saw it. So did the jury. So did Judge Hargrove. Lutz finally spoke, his voice strained. "I had nothing to do with the murder." Jack stepped closer, locking eyes with him. "But you were there." A muscle in Lutz's jaw twitched. Jack turned to the evidence table where a USB drive sat. "Yesterday, I had courthouse security review all available footage from the night of the murder." He held up the drive. "And what do you know? We found something interesting." Judge Hargrove nodded to the bailiff. "Play the footage." A court assistant took the USB and plugged it into the courtroom's large display monitor. The screen flickered, then loaded a grainy black and white video from the exterior security cameras outside Elliot Vaughn's estate. Jack faced the jury. This footage was recorded just minutes after Vaughn's estimated time of death. Watch carefully. On the screen, a figure emerged from the side of Vaughn's property. Jack raised a hand. Pause. The image froze, showing a man in a dark police-issued jacket stepping into the frame. Jack looked at Lutz. "Detective, would you like to explain why you were at the crime scene 15 minutes after the murder?" Lutz's face had turned pale. He ran a hand over his mouth, exhaling sharply. "The prosecution never mentioned you being there," Jack continued. "Your official report stated you arrived at 11:02 p.m., yet the security camera caught you leaving the property at 11:01 p.m. That means..." Jack turned to the jury. "You were already there before the murder was reported." Murmurs exploded in the courtroom. Lutz's breathing had quickened. He wiped at his forehead. His hands trembled slightly. Jack took a step closer. "I'll ask you again, Detective. Why were you there?" Lutz swallowed hard. Lucky's growl deepened. Lutz's hands clenched into fists. He shook his head violently, muttering to himself. Then, like a dam breaking, he snapped. "All right! I was there!" Lutz shouted, his voice cracking. The courtroom froze. Jack Calloway didn't blink. "Go on." Lutz's hands trembled as he gripped the witness stand. His chest rose and fell erratically. I was in debt, all right? Vaughn, he was tied to people, bad people. He was laundering money for an organization that doesn't forgive debts." Jack narrowed his eyes. "And you owed them." Lutz nodded, his whole body now shaking. I didn't have a choice. Vaughn threatened to expose me unless I helped him. I was supposed to cover for him, look the other way, but then someone else got to him first. Jack stepped closer. So you tried to pin it on Daniel Reyes. Lutz's breathing turned ragged. They told me to. Said I had to clean up the mess, or I'd be next. His eyes darted around the courtroom as if searching for an escape. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, Lutz lunged from the witness stand. Gasps filled the courtroom as he made a run for the exit. The bailiffs reacted instantly. Lutz didn't make it 3 steps before 2 uniformed officers tackled him to the ground. His limbs thrashed wildly, but within seconds, they had him pinned, cuffs locking around his wrists. Lucky barked, a single sharp bark of finality. Jack adjusted his tie and turned to Judge Hargrove. "Your Honor, I think that's all the confession we need." Hargrove, for once, looked shaken. He turned to the bailiffs. "Get him out of my courtroom." As Lutz was dragged away, the room erupted. Reporters rushed out the doors, eager to break the story. The jury looked stunned. Melissa Grayson sat still, her eyes locked on the now empty witness stand. Daniel Reyes, for the first time in weeks, let out a slow, shuddering breath. Lucky wagged his tail. Jack Calloway exhaled. The case wasn't just cracked open, it was obliterated. The echoes of Detective Ray Lutz's shouted confession still hung in the air as the courtroom settled into a stunned silence. Bailiffs had hauled the disgraced detective out of courtroom 4B, his face twisted in rage and panic. Even after being subdued, he had continued to shout, pleading, cursing, desperate to escape the consequences of his actions. But it was too late. Jack Calloway knew it, the jury knew it, and most importantly, Judge William Hargrove knew it. The gavel struck down with a definitive crack, cutting through the lingering chaos. "Order," Hargrove commanded, his voice steady, but beneath it was something deeper, something rare for him: emotion. Jack Calloway, standing tall at the defense table, turned to glance at his client. Daniel Reyes, the man who had spent the past few weeks fighting for his life, sat in stunned disbelief. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as though afraid that the moment might vanish if he let go. Lucky, the golden retriever who had become the trial's unexpected guardian, sat beside Daniel, tail flicking as if he too were waiting for the final word. And then it came. Judge Hargrove let out a slow, deliberate breath. Then he turned toward Melissa Grayson, the lead prosecutor, his eyes sharp. "Ms. Grayson," Hargrove said, "given the shocking developments in this case, does the state still wish to proceed with charges against Mr. Reyes?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Grayson, usually composed and commanding, hesitated. The weight of the trial's collapse was all over her face. She turned to look at Daniel Reyes. For weeks, she had believed he was guilty. Every piece of evidence had pointed to him. She had fought with conviction, had argued fiercely, only to find out that the case she had built had been poisoned from the inside. Finally, she turned back to Judge Hargrove and closed the case file in front of her. "The state..." She swallowed, then exhaled slowly. "The state moves to dismiss all charges against the defendant, Your Honor." A wave of gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Hargrove gave a single nod. "So granted." He turned toward the jury box. "Given this motion by the prosecution, the jury is officially dismissed. This case is now closed." The gavel slammed down one final time, and just like that, Daniel Reyes was a free man. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The nightmare that had begun with his wrongful arrest, the weeks of being painted as a murderer, the looming threat of a life sentence. It was over. Jack Calloway nudged his arm. "Daniel." Slowly, Daniel looked up. His eyes were wide, searching. "You're free." The words landed like a hammer. Daniel's breath hitched, his entire body trembling with the weight of his new reality. Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he could finally breathe. Lucky, as if sensing his emotions, leaned against him, pressing his warm body against Daniel's leg. A choked laugh escaped Daniel's throat as he ran a hand through the dog's fur. He looked down at him, eyes glistening. "I guess I owe you, huh?" Lucky wagged his tail, as if to say, "You're welcome." Judge Hargrove, still seated at the bench, watched the scene unfold before him. He was a man who had seen countless cases in his decades on the bench. He had ruled on life and death. He had prided himself on being unshakable. But this case? This was different. Hargrove cleared his throat, then did something completely unexpected. He stood up. The courtroom fell silent again. "I don't usually make personal statements," Hargrove began, his deep voice carrying through the room. "But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this case was unlike any I've presided over." Jack Calloway and Melissa Grayson both turned toward him, surprised. Hargrove's gaze settled on Lucky. Many cases are won or lost by sharp lawyers, careful arguments, and solid evidence. But this? He let out a rare chuckle. "This was the first time I've ever seen a dog uncover the truth." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Even Calloway smirked. Hargrove nodded at Daniel. "Mr. Reyes, you are an innocent man who came far too close to being wrongfully convicted. That is something we, as officers of the court, should never allow." He glanced at Grayson, who nodded, accepting the blame. Then, to everyone's shock, Hargrove looked at Lucky again and gave him a small nod of respect. "This court owes you, dog." Lucky wagged his tail. Melissa Grayson packed up her files in silence. She had spent years building a reputation as a prosecutor who didn't back down, but today she had lost. Not just lost, she had been played. Jack Calloway, sensing her frustration, walked over. "Hell of a day, huh?" She didn't look up. "I should have caught it sooner." Jack hesitated. Then, surprisingly, he softened. "You trusted the wrong guy," he admitted. "But you're not the bad guy, Melissa. You're a prosecutor. And now that you know the real corruption?" She finally met his gaze. Jack smiled. "I expect you'll tear them apart." Melissa studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. "You're damn right I will." She turned to her assistant. "I want every case Lutz ever worked on re-examined. We're going to dig." And just like that, Melissa Grayson was back in the fight. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel Reyes stood in the center of it all, staring at the dog who had, quite literally, saved his life. Lucky sat in front of him, watching, waiting. Jack Calloway clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "So, what's next?" Daniel glanced down at Lucky, his decision already made. "Well," he said with a small smile, "I think I just got a new roommate." Lucky's tail thumped wildly against the floor. Jack smirked. Figured as much. Judge Hargrove, who had lingered near the bench, let out a rare chuckle. A fitting ending. He turned toward Lucky one last time. "You make sure he stays out of trouble, huh?" Lucky barked once as if confirming the order. And with that, Daniel Reyes stepped into his new life, with Lucky right by his side. For the first time in months, Daniel Reyes woke up without chains around his wrists. No cold, steel cot, no guards barking orders, no suffocating weight of wrongful conviction pressing against his chest. Instead, he woke up in his own bed. Sunlight poured through the window of his small apartment, dust motes swirling in the morning glow. For a moment, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind trying to catch up to reality. He was free, and then, thump, thump, thump. A warm weight settled onto the bed, something furry and persistent. Daniel turned his head just as Lucky, the golden retriever who had saved his life, climbed up and plopped down beside him. Daniel let out a breathy laugh. "You're really making yourself at home, huh?" Lucky wagged his tail, his brown eyes filled with unshakable loyalty. Daniel reached out, ruffling the dog's golden fur. He had spent so many days wondering if he'd ever have a normal life again. And yet, here he was, a free man, with a dog that somehow knew the truth before anyone else. Lucky let out a soft huff, resting his head on Daniel's stomach. For the first time in months, Daniel Reyes felt safe. By noon, the world had already caught wind of the trial's bizarre conclusion. The local news stations ran segments with headlines like, "The dog who cracked the case, Golden Retriever barks his way to justice." "Unlikely hero, how a stray dog helped save an innocent man." Journalists flooded Daniel's front steps, eager to snap a picture of the most famous dog in the city. Reporters called it the trial of the century, not just because an innocent man had narrowly escaped conviction, but because his greatest ally in the fight for justice had been a stray golden retriever. Daniel, standing in the doorway of his apartment, squinted at the flashing cameras. "You weren't kidding," he muttered to Jack Calloway, who stood beside him, arms crossed. "This is insane." Calloway smirked. "Welcome to fame, kid." Lucky, seated at Daniel's feet, basked in the attention. He wagged his tail as reporters shouted his name, several holding out microphones as if he might actually answer. "Mr. Reyes," a reporter called, "can you tell us how Lucky ended up in the courtroom in the first place?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Honestly, I still don't know. One second, I was on trial for murder. The next, this dog just walked in off the street and started barking at the right moments." "Do you believe Lucky knew the truth all along?" another reporter asked. Daniel hesitated, looking down at Lucky, who gazed back up at him. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think he did." The reporters erupted with more questions. Jack clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "All right, that's enough for today. The guy just got out of jail. Give him a minute to breathe." Daniel flashed him a grateful look before ushering Lucky back inside, shutting out the flashing lights and frantic voices. He sighed. "You hear that, boy? You're famous." Lucky flopped onto the couch, completely unfazed. Daniel chuckled. "Guess it's just another day for you, huh?" While Lucky stole the spotlight, Jack Calloway received his own wave of attention. Inside his downtown law office, he found himself greeted with standing ovations from staff, congratulatory emails from colleagues, and even a few potential new clients knocking on his door. Despite the praise, Jack remained as he always was, calm, sharp, and completely unwilling to indulge in self-congratulation. He accepted the firm handshake of his paralegal, Maya Patel, who beamed with pride. "Hell of a win, Jack." Jack smirked, loosening his tie. "Not exactly a clean one, but I'll take it." Maya crossed her arms. "You know you just became a legend, right? A high-profile case, a wrongful conviction overturned, and a freaking dog cracked the mystery?" Jack scoffed, leaning against his desk. "Lucky cracked the case. I just followed the barks." Maya raised an eyebrow. "That's not the worst slogan for your law firm." Jack rolled his eyes. "Don't even think about it." Maya grinned, but then grew more serious. "For real, though, an innocent man almost lost his life in prison, and the system would have let it happen." Jack's jaw tightened. He had been thinking the same thing. Daniel had been minutes away from a guilty verdict. If Lucky hadn't interrupted, if the fabric evidence hadn't been questioned, if Lutz hadn't cracked under pressure, one innocent man would have gone away for life. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah," he admitted. "And that's why we keep fighting." As the sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Daniel stood outside on his apartment balcony, looking out over the city. Lucky sat beside him, his head resting on Daniel's knee. A week ago, Daniel had thought he would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. Now he had his freedom, a future, and a four-legged best friend. He reached down, scratching behind Lucky's ears. "So, what do you think?" Lucky lifted his head, gazing at him. "This is home now," Daniel murmured. "For both of us." Lucky's tail thumped against the wooden floor. Daniel exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Guess we both got a second chance, huh?" Lucky barked softly, as if agreeing, and as the city lights flickered to life below them, Lucky curled up beside Daniel, watching the world from the comfort of a home that was finally, truly his. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. As the night deepened, Daniel Reyes sat on his small couch, Lucky curled up beside him. The golden retriever, despite the chaos of the last few weeks, seemed perfectly at ease, like he had always belonged here. Daniel absently ran a hand through Lucky's fur, his mind drifting back to the first moment he had seen him, wandering into the courtroom, interrupting the trial, barking at all the right moments. It didn't make sense. He had never seen the dog before that day. No one had. There had been no reports of a missing golden retriever in the city, no shelter records, no owner ever came forward. Daniel frowned, looking down at Lucky. "Where did you even come from?" Lucky simply wagged his tail. Jack Calloway had jokingly called him a guardian angel. The newspapers were already spinning wild theories, that Lucky had belonged to Elliot Vaughn, that he was a trained service dog gone rogue, that he was some kind of cosmic force of justice wrapped in golden fur. Daniel chuckled. Absurd. And yet, something about it all felt too perfect. He had been on trial for a crime he didn't commit. The case had been airtight. The jury had been ready to convict. Then, out of nowhere, this mystery dog had appeared, barking only at the moments that mattered. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "You're just a regular dog, right?" Lucky didn't respond, just sat there, watching. Daniel could have sworn, just for a second, that there was something knowing in those eyes. Something more. Then Lucky stood, stretched, and hopped off the couch, heading toward Daniel's bedroom. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it didn't matter where Lucky came from. Maybe all that mattered was that he was here now, that he had saved a life. And as Lucky curled up at the foot of the bed, Daniel flicked off the lights, one last thought lingering in his mind as he drifted into sleep. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved.